March 25th, 1945. The deep interior of Japanese-occupied Borneo. The drone of the B-24 Liberator was a ghost sound. Here one moment, swallowed by a million square miles of jungle the next. Below, in the suffocating pre-dawn gloom, 8 figures descended under silk canopies, plunging into a world of perpetual twilight. Into the green hell. They were the first drop of Operation Samut, a name that meant nothing to anyone outside a handful of backrooms in Melbourne. They were operatives of the Inner Allied Services Department, better known by its far more evocative and far more secret designation, ZI Special Unit. They didn't officially exist. Their names were erased from regular army rosters. They were trained to be phantoms, specialists in sabotage, assassination, and the art of disappearing behind enemy lines. This time, their mission was something else. Something impossible. For months, whispers had been carried on the humid air, passed from village to village, eventually reaching Allied listening posts through faint, crackling radio transmissions. They were whispers of a place called Sandakan, a prisoner of war camp where thousands of Australian and British soldiers captured after the fall of Singapore were being systematically destroyed. Not with bullets, but with starvation, with disease, with back-breaking labor under a merciless sun. The rumors were fragmented, horrific. Rumors of men so skeletal their dog tags hung from their necks like oversized pendants. Rumors of guards who used prisoners for bayonet practice. Rumors of a death march, forcing the last few hundred survivors into the unforgiving jungle interior to die. The command structure received the intelligence. They filed the reports. The folder was thick, but the men in Sandakan were over 1,000 miles behind enemy lines. They were written off. An inevitable tragic cost of a war fought on a global scale. But a few men in Melbourne refused to let the file close. They saw not an acceptable loss, but a profound betrayal. Their plan was an act of audacious, almost suicidal desperation. It was a plan that would never be approved through official channels. It relied on a variable no military strategist could compute. They couldn't send an army. They couldn't launch an invasion, so they sent 8 men, then more. Dropped into the jungle with radios, explosives, and a mission so sensitive it was communicated only verbally. Their primary objective, to make contact with the indigenous tribes of the interior. They were to find the Iban, the Kayan, the Kelabit. They were to find the Dayak. The people known to the outside world for one terrifying reason. They were headhunters. This was the secret at the heart of Operation Samut, the part scrubbed from the initial reports. The Allied war effort, the great crusade of industrialized, civilized nations, was about to form a blood pact with warriors whose ancestral laws demanded a head for a head. The official documents, the ones that survived the post-war culling of sensitive files, would later speak of fostering local goodwill and employing indigenous assets. A sterile language for a savage reality. The reality was Australian commandos, men like the brilliant, eccentric Major Tom Harrison, living in tribal longhouses, learning ancient rituals and forging an army from men the Japanese Empire dismissed as primitives. They traded modern rifles for ancient jungle craft. They taught the Dayak how to set ambushes for Japanese patrols, and in return, the Dayak taught the Australians how to move through the jungle without a sound, how to read the forest like a book, and how to kill with a silent dart from a blowpipe. They came as soldiers of a modern army. They left as something else. The field reports sent back via crackling radio were concise. Enemy patrol ambushed, 10 killed. They omitted the details. They didn't mention the victory celebrations that followed, or the smoke-blackened trophies that were presented to the Australian commanders as a sign of loyalty and shared victory. They didn't mention that the taking of heads, a practice the commandos were initially horrified by, became a brutally effective tool of psychological warfare, a terror tactic that shattered Japanese morale in a way no bombing raid ever could. For over 50 years, this story of an unholy and uniquely successful alliance remained a footnote, buried under layers of classification and official discomfort. The records were sealed. The memories were suppressed. Why was this extraordinary chapter of the Pacific War deliberately erased from the popular narrative? Was it merely shame over the brutal methods employed? Or was the truth of what happened in the jungle, the lines that were crossed, the compromises that were made, the darkness that both the rescuers and the rescued had to embrace, simply too raw for the clean pages of history? Now, through declassified intelligence files, hidden field diaries, and the last living voices from that forgotten war, a different story emerges. A story of a rescue mission at the edge of the world, fought by men the history books forgot, for prisoners everyone else had already condemned to death. February 16th, 1942, Whitehall, London. Singapore was gone. The Gibraltar of the East, the impregnable fortress, gone. A whisper in the hallowed halls of the War Office, then a roar. A telex clattering in the silence of a basement room. 85,000 men, British, Australian, Indian, handed over, surrendered. The single largest defeat in the history of the British Army. A number so large it was an abstraction. 85,000 souls. Nobody in London could picture it. The heat, the humidity, the shame. They saw maps and flag pins. They saw a catastrophic failure of strategy. They did not see the faces. Not yet. They did not see the long columns of men, disarmed and bewildered, marching down Orchard Road under the gaze of their conquerors. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, his face a mask of grim duty, walking to the Ford factory, to sign away an empire. And from that moment, the abstraction began to take on a terrifyingly concrete form. The men were herded into the Changi prison area. A space meant for 5,000 now held 50,000. But Changi was only the beginning, a way station on the road to hell. The Japanese Empire needed labor, slave labor, to build its airfields, its railways, its new Pacific frontier. And the 85,000 were a ready-made workforce. Soon the ships began to arrive. They were not passenger liners, no. They were rusting freighters, coal haulers, cargo vessels with names that would become infamous. The Usuri Maru, the Tofuku Maru. They were called hell ships for good reason. Men were packed into the holds, standing room only in tropical heat with little water and no sanitation. Dysentery, cholera, heat stroke. Men died before the journey even truly began. They died in the dark, pressed against their comrades. Their bodies were thrown overboard, a splash in the South China Sea. Another number subtracted from the total. Their destination was a place most had never heard of. A vast, jungle-choked island. British North Borneo. A map drawn from memory by a survivor and now held in the Australian War Memorial Archives is a spiderweb of crude tracks and camps. Sandakan, Ranao, Kuching, Labuan, names that became synonyms for death. The largest of these, the epicenter of the horror, was Sandakan, a prisoner of war camp on the edge of a harbor surrounded by impenetrable green. By 1943, nearly 3,000 Allied prisoners, mostly Australian and British, were incarcerated there. They were the men of the 8th Australian Division and the British 18th Division. The men who had fought in Malaya, the men who had surrendered at Singapore. The folder in the MI9 archives is thin. Codenamed Kingfisher, it contains scraps of intelligence, whispers. A report from a local headhunter passed through a Chinese merchant to a stay-behind operative. It spoke of a camp, of skeletal men, of impossible labor. The folder stated, prisoners engaged in construction of military aerodrome. Rations inadequate. Health deteriorating rapidly. Inadequate was a word used by men in offices. The reality was a slow, calculated starvation. The daily ration was a handful of maggoty rice. A scrap of dried fish, maybe. A spoonful of greens if they were lucky. Private Albert Hobbs, 2SR 10th Field Regiment, later recalled the obsession. Food. It was the only topic of conversation, the only dream. He was 19, from Wagga Wagga. He weighed less than 80 pounds. The camp was a skeleton factory. Beriberi swelled their legs and torsos until they could not walk. Tropical ulcers ate flesh down to the bone. Malaria and dysentery were constant, relentless companions. The Japanese guards, under the command of Captain Hoshijima Susumi, enforced a brutal discipline. Beatings were a daily ritual for a stolen glance, for a moment's rest, for failing to bow correctly. Men were tied to a post in the searing sun. They were forced into wooden cages too small to stand or lie down in. They were worked from dawn until dusk on the airfield, their bodies wasting away under the uncaring eye of the Kempeitai, the Japanese secret police. An artistic sketch, rendered in charcoal by a war artist from the testimony of Gunner Wallace Cleary, shows the camp. The long, dilapidated huts raised on stilts. The muddy ground. The skeletal figures in loincloths hauling rocks. In the corner, a guard stands with a rifle, his face impassive. The caption reads simply, Sandakan POW Camp, 1944. And then the main thing started. By late 1944, the tide of the war had turned. The Americans were coming. MacArthur was island hopping across the Pacific. Allied planes began to appear in the skies over Borneo, bombing the very airfield the prisoners had been forced to build. The Japanese command panicked. The prisoners were a liability, but they were also a source of labor. The order came down from the headquarters of the 37th Japanese Army. The prisoners were to be moved inland, away from the coast, away from any potential rescue. They were to march to a place called Ranao, 160 miles away, through some of the most formidable and unforgiving jungle terrain on the planet. The first march began on January 28, 1945. 455 of the fittest prisoners were chosen. Fittest was a relative term. They were simply the least sick, the least emaciated. Each man was forced to carry heavy loads of Japanese equipment and ammunition. Their own packs contained nothing, a water bottle if they were lucky. The track was not a road. It was a quagmire of mud, a tangle of roots, a series of near-vertical climbs. The jungle canopy blocked out the sky. The humidity was a physical weight. Leeches, scorpions, mosquitoes. They marched, boots disintegrated, uniforms rotted to threads, feet became bloody stumps. Men who fell behind were not helped. They were prodded with bayonets, screamed at. If they could not get up, they were left, or they were shot. A single flat crack in the jungle's humidity. Another man gone, the column kept moving. The survivors would hear the shot and know. They would just know. One less mouth to feed. One less body to march. Of the 455 who started, only 190 reached Ranao. And their ordeal was not over. They were put to work, building huts on starvation rations, dying daily. A second march began on May 29, 1945. 537 prisoners. Their condition was even worse than the first group's. The guards were more brutal. The pace was more punishing. The route was littered with the bodies of those from the first march. Unburied, left where they fell. A warning, a promise. This time, Japanese killing squads moved with the rear of the column. Their job was simple: to execute anyone who could not keep pace. No witnesses, no survivors. The order was absolute. An Australian warrant officer, William Stickpowich, who later escaped, described it. He saw men sit down by the side of the track, their eyes vacant. They knew what was coming. They would just nod to their friends. And wait. A shot. Then silence. Only 183 men from this second group made it to Ranao. Back at Sandakan, the camp was a charnel house. The remaining prisoners, too sick to move, were left to die. When the Allied bombings intensified, the Japanese decided to eliminate them all. In July, the last 288 prisoners at Sandakan were marched into the jungle in small groups and massacred. The camp was burned to the ground, destroyed, to erase the evidence, to erase the crime. At Ranao, the few survivors of the marches were now too weak to work. Their purpose served. On August 1st, 1945, the last of them were taken out and shot. Just weeks before the war ended. Weeks. Of the 2,434 Australian and British prisoners who were held at Sandakan or who set out on the death marches, Only 6 survived. 6, all of them Australian. All of them escapees who were helped by local villagers. Not a single British prisoner survived. Not one. The official report, designated File 73B, compiled from the testimony of those 6 men, is one of the most harrowing documents of the Second World War. It is a meticulous catalog of starvation, disease, torture, and mass murder. But even that report could not capture the final order, the one that came down from command. An order that was intercepted by Allied intelligence too late. Too late for anyone. It was a simple directive, a final solution for the Borneo problem, and it was to be carried out with absolute prejudice. December 3rd, 1944. Fraser Island, Queensland. They didn't exist, not officially, not on any roster that mattered. They were the ghosts of the Australian Army, phantoms conjured by a secret directive from General Blamey's desk. The folder was called SRD, Services Reconnaissance Department, a bland name for a brutal purpose. Its operational arm was Z Special Unit. Z, the last letter of the alphabet, the last resort. The men who trained on the white sands of Fraser Island, in the crocodile-infested waters of the Hinchinbrook Channel, were not soldiers. Not in the conventional sense. They wore no uniforms, carried no dog tags. If caught, they were spies. And spies were shot. Or worse. Much worse. The operation was codenamed Seamute, the Malay word for ant. Ants, small, numerous. Getting under the skin of a giant. That was the idea. A handful of men dropped deep into the Japanese-occupied island of Borneo to become 1,000 pinpricks of resistance. The plan was audacious, almost insane. They would drop blind into the dense, unmapped jungle highlands of central Borneo, a vast green hell teeming with hostile tribes, Japanese patrols, and 1,000 different ways to die from disease, starvation, or a venomous snake. The brief was simple, deceptively simple. Gather intelligence, organize the indigenous tribes into a guerrilla army, disrupt Japanese operations, and wait. Wait for the main invasion. The architects of Samut were an unlikely pair. Major G.S. Toby Carter, a pre-war oil man from Sarawak. He knew the land, the rivers, the people. Carter was the soldier, methodical, quiet, a professional. Then there was Tom Harrison, an eccentric, brilliant, and often infuriating anthropologist, ornithologist, and adventurer who had lived with the tribes of Borneo before the war. He knew their customs, their languages, their souls. Harrison was the scientist, the odd couple of jungle warfare. They were joined by others: Soshan, Wiley, Sutcliffe, Morrison, men who knew the jungle, men who spoke the languages, men who were not afraid of the dark. Their primary targets were the tribes: the Dayaks, the Iban, the Murut, the Kenya. Headhunters, some of them. Feared warriors. The Japanese had tried to subdue them. They had failed. Z Special Unit wouldn't try to subdue them. They would arm them. They would train them in modern sabotage, demolition, and ambush tactics. Combine the ancient jungle craft with the cold lethality of modern warfare. The blowpipe and the Sten gun, the parang and the plastic explosive. They would become an army of shadows, striking from the jungle depths, melting away before the Japanese could react. An army of ants. The mission had another unspoken objective. A desperate, almost hopeless objective. The rescue of prisoners of war. Rumors trickled out of Borneo. Whispers of camps, of starvation, of death marches. Sandakan. The name was a whisper of dread in the Allied command posts in Morotai. 2,700 men. Australian. British. Held in brutal captivity. The intelligence was fragmented, but the picture it painted was hellish. The men of Samut were tasked to find them, to assess their condition, to prepare for a rescue that might never come. But they had to try. They had to be the first glimmer of hope. This was all prelude. Prelude to Operation Oboe, a massive three-pronged amphibious assault to liberate Borneo. Obo 1 for Tarakan, Obo 2 for Balikpapan, and Obo 6 for Brunei Bay, the 9th Australian Division, veterans of North Africa, veterans of New Guinea. They were waiting on Morotai, their ships assembling, their landing craft being waterproofed. But they would be landing blind without Samut. They needed Carter's and Harrison's intelligence. Where were the coastal guns? Where were the troop concentrations? Where were the minefields? Samut was the key in the lock. Obo was the door being kicked down. The liberation of Brunei town, the capture of the oil fields at Saria and Miri, it all depended on a few dozen men with parachutes and cyanide pills. L pills, the last resort. March 1945. UAAF Base Morotai. The staging ground. The B-24 Liberator stood silent on the coral airstrip, their bomb bays converted to carry men and supplies. Not bombs. The men of Samut 1, Carter's team, checked their gear one last time. Radio sets, weapons, medical kits, gold sovereigns for trading. Everything wrapped in waterproof canvas. They were pale under the harsh electric lights of the briefing hut. Young men, so young. They looked at the maps, the red circles marking the drop zones deep in the Kelebit Highlands. A world away. Another planet. Nobody knew what to expect. Nobody. The jungle kept its secrets. The Japanese were an enigma. Would the tribes be friendly? Hostile? Would the drop be accurate, or would they be scattered across 100 miles of impenetrable wilderness? Questions without answers. There was only the mission. The drone of the Liberator's 4 Pratt & Whitney engines was a physical presence, a vibration in the bones. For hours they flew east into the blackness, over the Celebes Sea. A single, fragile aircraft in an immense, hostile sky. Below them, nothing, just the darkness. A darkness that held an island, an enemy, a destiny. Then a change in the engine node. The descent began. The dispatcher moved down the narrow fuselage. A voice, calm, professional. Stand by. The red light glowed, casting their faces in a demonic light. The wind howled through the open hatch, a hungry sound. Below was the enemy. Below was the jungle. Below was the unknown. The green light flashed, a sudden, violent green. The dispatcher's voice, a flat, emotionless sound. Go. And they fell into the darkness. January 5th, 1945. Morotai, Dutch East Indies. To take a head was to take a soul. It was a transfer of power, a receipt for a debt paid in blood. Major Tom Harrison knew this. He knew it better than any man in a khaki uniform. He wasn't a soldier. Not really. He was an anthropologist, an ornithologist, an adventurer who had lived among the tribes of Borneo before the world caught fire. The file on him at Z Special Unit Headquarters was thin, almost dismissive. Eccentric, unorthodox, possible asset. Possible. The Dayaks were a people of the river and the forest, a collection of tribes. Iban, Kayan, Kenya, Bidayu. They were animists living in a world swarming with spirits. Good spirits, evil spirits, and the spirits demanded balance. Headhunting, the practice they called Ngayao, was part of that balance. It wasn't murder. It was a ritual, a necessity. A boy could not become a man without it. A chieftain's death could not be properly mourned until a new head was brought to the longhouse. A new head brought spiritual energy. It protected the village. It ensured a good harvest. It was life. It was power. It was everything. The Dutch had tried to stop it. The White Rajas of Sarawak, the Brooke family, had largely succeeded. They outlawed the practice, substituting symbolic gestures for the real thing. For decades, the warrior spirits of the Dayak slept. The great war gongs were silent. The ceremonial swords, the mandau, hung on the longhouse walls, gathering dust and smoke. They were relics, memories. Then the Japanese came. They came with arrogance and unbelievable cruelty. They took rice, they took women, they took lives. They did not understand adat, the ancient customary law that governed all things. They broke the balance. They offended the spirits of the land, the river, the sky. Whispers started in the longhouses, dark and quiet as the jungle night. Rumors. The old men, the ones who remembered, began to talk. The time for symbols was over. The time for sleeping was over. A debt had to be paid, a head for a head, a soul for a soul. Tom Harrison landed by parachute in the Kelebit Highlands with a handful of commandos. Operation Samut. He was 33 years old. He carried a Sten gun, but his real weapon was knowledge. He didn't march into the village of Barrio demanding allegiance. He walked in, unarmed, and asked for the chief. He knew the customs. He understood the hierarchy. He respected the omens. Some said he spoke their language. Not fluently, but enough. He spoke of a new king, a king across the sea who needed their help. The Dyaks were suspicious. They had seen white men before. Dutch, British, now Japanese. Why should these new ones be any different? They sat in the smoky dark of the longhouse, the warriors lean and hard, their eyes like chips of obsidian. Harrison sat with them. He ate their food. He drank their rice wine, the tuak. He didn't make promises of a new world. He made a single, simple offer, a chance to be warriors again. The report, written later in a spidery hand on flimsy paper, stated they were not interested in the geopolitics of the Allied cause. They were interested in the Japanese, specifically in Japanese heads. Harrison gave them what they wanted, legitimacy, and something more, weapons, crates of them, dropped from the bellies of liberators that came like thunderous gods in the night. Lee Enfield rifles, steam guns, grenades, plastic explosives. The training was a strange reversal. The Australian commandos taught the Dyaks how to use a bolt-action rifle, how to set a fuse. But the Dyaks taught the commandos how to live, how to move without a sound, how to read a bent twig, a disturbed patch of moss, the cry of a bird. How to become ghosts. They were the masters of the jungle. The Japanese, with their heavy boots and noisy patrols, were clumsy children by comparison. The intelligence they gathered was priceless. They moved like shadows through territory the Japanese considered impenetrable. They mapped garrisons, counted patrols, identified officers. A sketch of a machine gun nest on a piece of bark. A whisper about a fuel dump hidden up a tributary. They knew the rivers, the trails, the secret ways. They knew everything. The Japanese knew nothing. They were blind. And they were being watched. Then came the rescues. Downed American airmen, their planes swatted from the sky, drifting into the green canopy. Escaped prisoners from the Sandakan Death March, skeletons in rags, stumbling through a hell they could not comprehend. The Dyak trackers found them. They didn't see enemies or allies. They saw men in need. They carried them, fed them, and guided them through hundreds of miles of jungle to safety. These were the savages, the headhunters. One evening, Harrison stood with a Kayan chieftain, watching the warriors prepare. They painted their faces with charcoal and clay. They sharpened the heavy, curved blades of their mandau. They chanted the old songs, the ones forbidden for a generation. The air was thick with purpose, with menace. It was the revival of a tradition the civilized world had condemned. But here, in the heart of darkness, it was the only thing that made sense. The deal was sealed. The weapons were distributed. The first raid was planned for a small Japanese outpost on the Baram River. The gongs began to beat, a slow rhythm, a heart rhythm, the rhythm of the hunt. The headhunters were back, but now they hunted for the allies. They hunted for the king. The old spirits were awake, and they were hungry. June 10th, 1945, Brunei Bay, North Borneo. They said a dead man weighed more than a living one. A fact. In the camps at Sandakan, at Batu Lintang, at Kuching, it was a statistical certainty. A body swollen with beriberi, with wet gangrene, was heavier than the shrunken husk of a man still drawing breath. The men of the Australian 9th Division, making their amphibious landings under a steel-gray sky, did not know this. Not yet. They were the main show. the sledgehammer. But the real work, the ghost work, had been happening for months in the Green Hell inland. Whispers traveled on the jungle vine. They said apparitions haunted the Japanese. Pale-skinned spirits with automatic weapons who moved with the jungle people. The Iban, the Kenya, the Kayan, the Dayak. The men Major Tom Harrison had courted with salt and tobacco and respect. They knew the rivers. They knew the paths. They knew the enemy. They knew the price of collaboration, and they exacted it with a parang, a clean cut, a transfer of a soul, an accounting. The Z Special Unit operatives, men like Major Bill Jinks and Sergeant Jack Sue, did not take heads. But they understood the currency. They offered a new target, a new accounting, the Japanese. The partnership was a thing of brutal, beautiful efficiency. A patrol would melt into the jungle. 3 Australians, maybe 4. A dozen Dayak fighters, silent in loincloths, their bodies a tapestry of tattoos telling stories of courage and lineage. The Australians brought the explosives, the Sten guns, the grim determination. The Dayaks brought the jungle itself. They were its eyes, its ears, its vengeful spirit. A communication line would go dead between Jesselton and Renau. A Japanese river barge, heavy with ammunition, would suddenly erupt in a geyser of flame and splintered wood. A patrol of the Kempe Tai, the dreaded secret police, would march down a trail and simply vanish. No witnesses, no survivors. Just an unnerving silence where men used to be. The folder had once existed in some Canberra filing cabinet, might have been called Operation Semut. But the Dayaks had another name for it. I saw. Trouble. They were making trouble for the invaders. Big trouble. It was an art form, a flash, a scream. The jungle swallowed the sound. The convoy, a snake of smoking metal and twisted bodies, lay dead on the muddy track to Keningau. The ambush was a symphony of chaos conducted in seconds. A claymore mine, triggered by an Aussie corporal. A volley of fire from hidden stens. And then the Dayaks would descend, parangs flashing, blowpipes puffing poisoned darts. Efficient. Terrifyingly efficient. Supply dumps, communication lines, river patrols, collaborators. One by one, the sinews of Japanese control were severed. The Japanese command in Kuching was blind. Their patrols vanished. Their couriers were found headless. Their authority dissolved into the jungle damp. They called the attackers Hantus, ghosts. Every shadow held a Dayak. Every rustle of leaves was a Sten gun cocking. But sabotage was one thing. A life for a life. Rescuing the living dead was another. The rumors from inside the camps were worse than any ghost story. They spoke of starvation as a policy, of men eating snakes, rats, slugs. They spoke of the death marches, the long, staggering columns of Allied prisoners forced from Sandakan into the unforgiving interior. A march to nowhere, a march to die. A report smuggled out by a local woman reached a Z Unit patrol near the Suk River. It used one word over and over. Mati. Dead. The men were dead. The men were dying. That's when the mission changed. The hunt for the living began. An Australian Dayak patrol, led by a 24-year-old lieutenant named Alan Quayle, found the first group. 6 of them. 6 walking skeletons who thought they were seeing angels in the dappled jungle light. An Australian gunner, a British bombardier, 4 Indian sappers from the Punjab regiment. Their uniforms were rags. Their skin was parchment pulled tight over bone, covered in weeping tropical ulcers. Their eyes were pits of despair. The smell of dysentery, of gangrene, of hopelessness. The Dayak fighters, men who took heads without flinching, were silent. They looked upon the skeletal figures with a profound, solemn pity. They carried them in makeshift litters, silent as smoke, feeding them sips of boiled water and mashed tapioca. The Australians administered the precious sulfa drugs, cleaned the wounds, whispered words of reassurance. You're safe now. You're safe. For those 6, it was true. For hundreds of others on the death march, it was too late. Then came the 20th Infantry Brigade, part of the main landing force at Brunei Bay. They came ashore with Sherman tanks and 25-pounder guns, a conventional army for a conventional fight. They pushed inland, expecting heavy resistance. They found chaos. The Japanese were already broken, not by the tanks, not by the artillery. They were broken by fear. Their command structure was a decapitated serpent, its body still twitching. The intelligence flowed from the jungle. Pinpoint maps of enemy positions. Lists of collaborators. Weak points in the defense. It all came from the Headhunters, from the men who didn't exist and their Dayak allies. The liberation of the Batu Lintang camp near Kuching was the culmination. It wasn't a battle, it was an opening of a tomb. When the men of the 215th Infantry Battalion finally broke through the gates on September 11th, they found 2,024 souls. They were not soldiers, they were survivors. Ghosts in the sunlight. The list was a roll call of a fallen empire. 1,392 British, 428 Australian, 137 Indian, 67 Dutch. Civilians, women, children, and the graves. A field of crude wooden crosses. So many graves. The humanitarian impact was staggering. It was more than a military victory, it was an exorcism. For every Japanese soldier killed in a jungle ambush, a prisoner had lived another day. For every radio transmitter destroyed, a death march had been delayed. A chance. The joint effort of the Australians and the Dayaks had bought them a chance. But the war's end brought a new, colder terror. A captured officer in Labuan talked. Under interrogation, he mentioned a document, a directive. He was sweating, not from the heat, from memory. His eyes darted around the tent, as if the ghosts of his own orders were there with him. The information was relayed to Major Harrison's command post in the Kelabit Highlands. A search was organized. A runner, a young Kenya boy, brought it 2 days later. A damp piece of paper stamped with the seal of the 37th Army Headquarters. It was Imperial Japanese Army Form 274. A simple, innocuous designation. It was a kill order. An order for the systematic execution of every remaining prisoner on the island, military and civilian, upon the first sign of an Allied landing. The date on the order was April. It was now September. The landings had happened months ago. The order should have been carried out. It wasn't. Because of the chaos, because of the Esau, because of the ghosts. The war was won, but the killing wasn't finished. Not yet. Can a nation ever truly know its victory without honoring the ghosts who secured it? The official histories remain clean, sanitized. They do not speak of the pacts made in the smoky dark of a longhouse, under the gaze of obsidian eyes. They do not detail the grim calculus of rescue, where the price of one Allied life was paid in another's, a debt settled by ancient ritual deep in the Borneo interior. They mention the B-24 liberators, but not the silent columns of painted warriors who moved like shadows beneath their phantom drone. They were the men who did what their commanders in tidy offices could not. The men history chose to forget. This was not a war of orders and communiques. It was a war of whispers, a war of shared desperation, a war of the jungle itself. They came as soldiers of an empire, trained in a world of straight lines and clear commands. They left as something else entirely, brothers to the men the world called savages, a transformation that no metal could ever recognize, a transformation born of necessity, a transformation born of a shared, terrible humanity. The truth of their campaign was never written in a general's directive. It was etched in the memories of the few who survived, etched in the jungle. The files were closed in 1945. The deaths were never recorded. The ghosts were never given names. But some stories refuse to die. They are merely absorbed into the soil, into memory, into the silence that grows between the trees.